Good morning. I've, like most people, spent the last 12 months working from home with a 6-month-old puppy, so this is a bit of a different environment. I'm going to talk about superannuation because it's arguably the most boring subject you could possibly talk about, but I'm going to try and make it interesting, I promise. So why does your super matter? I want to come back to Kate's original question, which is the one that we get asked all the time: what can I do about climate? And other than running for Parliament yourself and trying to disrupt, Angus Taylor and Scott Morrison, wow, that was a weird combination. The thing you can do is think about your super. You can switch your electricity provider to a green provider, but changing your super can have a huge impact. And I'll briefly explain why. This is where we are. These are Australia's national emissions since 1990. As you can see, relatively flat, somewhere between 500 and 600 million tonnes a year. And those are the different projections that we need to get to net zero. That current projected trend makes me pretty angry, to be honest. I look at this chart most weeks, and that grey line is essentially what our current government has us on. That's the trajectory. And where we want to be is arguably, by that you really want to get the lowest, the fastest decline possible, which is that 50% cut by 2030. This is part of the problem. These are the top 10 carbon majors. Let me explain this chart to you. These are the 10 companies in Australia that produce the most emissions, including the coal and gas that they sell overseas. So if you exclude the coal and gas they sell overseas, AGL would probably be at the top. But once you include the coal and gas, BHP and Glencore come out on top every time. And the reason that's important is that most people in this room are invested in those companies. Now that's a pretty daunting thing to accept, that you're actually profiting from this, because these are the companies that are responsible for climate. This is where it gets interesting. This is why your super matters. So where we are now, 2020, superannuation, the broader superannuation system is about $3 trillion. All right, it probably doesn't mean a lot. But by 2038, it's projected to get to $10 trillion, a massive number. Superannuation funds control somewhere between a third and a half of most ASX-listed companies. They're getting so big in global terms, they can't invest in Australia anymore. They have to just keep sending money overseas. They're that big. And with that size comes immense power. Those superannuation funds that we're all invested in essentially control the way Australia's companies are run. Well, they can, but most of the time they're passive, okay? So when it comes to companies, if I go back to that list of companies there, like BHP and Glencore and Anglo American and so on, they take a passive role. So they will, they'll try to get the company to behave better, but they won't necessarily tell them that they should stop digging up fossil fuels. And that's essentially what the organisation that I work for, ACCR, does. We are effectively retail shareholders, but we try and get those superannuation funds to take action on these companies. Now, most of you, and I believe there's one of the super funds are actually in the room, but most of you are probably members of funds like Aware Super or HESTA, because they're responsible for most of the health sector. And these funds they're not terrible. They're actually pretty good. And they have options which are fossil fuel free, if that's what you want to do. So you can actually do that right now. If you're actually sitting on your phone, you can actually switch your option in your super fund right now to be fossil fuel free, which means you won't be invested in those companies. We're going to take a slightly controversial view here. And the view is that those funds will remain invested in these companies for the foreseeable future, because most members are indifferent and they don't care. So what they need to do is they need to change these companies. And the only way they're going to change them is by setting very clear expectations that you don't want BHP spending $2 billion a year on oil and gas exploration. You want them spending it on the transition. And if they don't listen, then they take the ultimate action, and that is you vote directors off the board, okay? The board of directors controls the company. Everybody knows that. We saw it after the Banking Royal Commission, that directors were removed off AMP, off NAB, off ANZ. When the push comes to shove, investors will get rid of directors, but we're not seeing it happening at these companies. And that's part of the problem, is that the board isn't being held accountable for the decisions that they're making. And that's the ask that we put to the super funds that we engage with, and that's the ask that we'd compel you to put to your super fund. It's very easy to actually to send an email to your fund right now and say, what are you doing about climate? What are you doing about BHP? What are you doing about Woodside and Santos who want to double production in the next 5 to 10 years? That's the easiest thing you can possibly do on climate. It's almost easier than actually changing your electricity provider, believe it or not, because it's just an email. But the thing about most super funds is that they acknowledge that most of their members don't really care. They're indifferent, and they call them sticky. And what that means is that they never go anywhere. So they join when they're young and they stay until they retire. And the super funds really enjoy that stickiness because, well, the money's just going to sit there. They don't have to worry about the members. They engage with them. They'll send them emails, but most members don't really care. So get engaged with your super fund. They really do respond to membership. They really do, because so few people actually get in touch with them about this kind of issue. So the two things that we ask that list of companies to do is set ambitious targets. And that means not developing more fossil fuels. The other one is ending the negative lobbying. We all know the role that the groups like the Business Council and the Minerals Council have played for the last 20 years. End the negative lobbying. And that's the easiest thing you can do. Get in touch with your super fund. Do it today. And if you want to switch to a fossil fuel-free option, you can do that today as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dan. It's really nice to have clear action that you can take straight away right now whilst you're on your phone. Again, I'm asking for Twitter questions on hashtag code is 0. And I'll ask the whole panel for their perspectives on that. But really, I think the ethical issue is often of great interest to health professionals. I know that Tim has said in one of his previous talks, Exxon knew about this 40 years ago. And I'm a public health doctor. For us, it's exactly the same as the tobacco industry. Fossil fuel industry has known about this for years, and yet they have embarked on a campaign of misinformation, discrediting scientists, muddying the waters and so on. So, for public health people like me, it's exactly the same as the tobacco industry. So I'd just like to ask the panel for their reflections on Dan's talk, and with a particular slant sort of on ethics, I guess. Courtney.
Thanks. Yes, so we are all part of a profession or professions that are committed to doing no harm. And it's definitely important that we do no harm with our investments as well as our work inside the hospital. And one of the reasons why it's so important for health professionals to take action on this is because we're amongst the most trusted voices in society. So when you look at rankings of who people trust, we're almost always near the top. Nurses are usually right at the top. Doctors are up there somewhere too. So when we say something, it lands more powerfully than, for instance, if a politician says something. And we also know from communication studies that communicating climate change in a health frame is the best way to motivate populations to take action across the political spectrum, and particularly when we're talking about the health of children. So we know from some of the work that Nick Watts did at the Lancet Countdown with these huge research collaboratives that climate change is the greatest public health threat of the 21st century. But at least from polling we've done here in Canada, we know that people don't know that. Doctors don't know that because it's still not in curricula. Our politicians don't know that, and the public at large don't know that. So when we look at the response we've taken as a global community to the coronavirus crisis, it's clear that we care about one another. And what we need to do as health professionals is use our trusted voices to connect climate change to health and make it clear that an expression of our caring for one another needs to extend to our care of the climate. And part of that is making sure our investments are in alignment with that.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you. Courtney. Nick.
Yeah, not an enormous amount to add other than yes, of course. There's no question, right, that the ethics are aligned. There's absolutely, you're entirely right, Kate. Call it what it is. This is deliberate misinformation, and it's an industry that is actively polluting, actively, killing. That 8.4 million number should be repeated again and again and again and again. Courtney, some of that polling, and there's some new research we're about to publish in a little bit, is important to bear in mind. And I suppose on the one hand, it's important to talk about that threat and to talk about the harms of some of these industries and the harms of climate change and what that does to human health and well-being, and that motivates. Some of the new information we have, we've done a series of sort of half polling, half sort of lab-based interventions scattered across 6-7 countries. People react when you talk about climate change as a health issue. People really react when you talk about the positives of a response. When you talk about not just divest, not just what you're moving away from, but you talk about what we're investing in, about the kind of community that we want to build together. That's when you talk about those sort of positive investing in health kind of narratives. That's what seems to motivate a lot, and also what seems to motivate over the long term. That seems to stick more and more. In every country we've tested, oddly, except for Germany, but let's not get into German psychology now.
Thanks, Nick. Tim, any thoughts?
One of the key names that was not on Dan's list was Rio Tinto. Particularly given I talk to Dan quite a lot, I know Rio Tinto is probably one of the worst ESG firms in the world, but from a climate perspective, they've abrogated their responsibility. Now, they would argue they showed leadership. They divested their coal exposure. They divested any responsibility for cleaning up the mess that they profited from for decades. But we can talk about ESG on Rio till the cows come home, and Dan can lead us on that. But the reality is it's not about divesting. You go to the number one player there, BHP. BHP, as Dan just said, is investing $1 to $2 billion a year in new fossil fuel developments. So we do have Luddites, and I use that, and I didn't mention Matt Canavan, I just said Luddites talking about, we can't stop using fossil fuels today because we wouldn't have power. No one's talking about stopping using it today. We're talking about stopping using it in 5 or 10 years' time and getting on that trajectory, the trajectory that Dan talked about, down 50% in the next decade. Now, that means you don't need more fossil fuels. So the last thing you want to be doing is investing in a stranded asset like BHP is, developing more oil and gas. So long answer to say, divestment is not the answer. And so when Dan says to you, switch your money over to an ESG fund, but first, before you do that, he said, engage with your super fund, because you want the whole fund to move, not just your money. And so engage with your super fund and tell them what you want and why you want it. And it's amazing how few informed voices can change the entire board of global giants, the super funds.
So just one question that's come through on Twitter. How important are the state versus the federal government on this issue? It seems like New South Wales state government with Matt Kean is fairly forward-looking on renewable energy. What's your take on that?
You've probably got a stronger view than me, mate.
Okay. I advise a couple of politicians on all sides of the desk, including Matt Kean and Zali Steggles. We'll talk to anyone who's actually willing to take action. We're not politically aligned. Fortunately, none of my funding comes from any government, so I don't have to worry about what I say, other than defamation. Matt Kean has been brilliant. I don't compliment too many politicians, but Matt Kean's really interested in the welfare of his children and his grandchildren to be, intergenerational equity. And so I'll embrace any politician that has the courage and is willing to stand up to the fossil fuel lobbyists and all of their billions of dollars of donations and speak truth. And that's what Matt Kean does, and he's leading New South Wales. And because he's a Liberal, he might actually convince Scott Morrison to actually ignore what the Luddites in the National Party are telling Scott every single day and actually say to Scott, look, you actually probably want to be re-elected. You've got no chance unless you deal with climate change, unless we deal with our American ally, President Biden, who's all in on climate change. So at the end of the day, I'm all for politicians of any political alignment to act on the science and do what's in the national interest of Australia, what's in the interest of all of our children.